few games hold up as well as Dead Space. Despite releasing 13 years ago, Visceral Games' space horror shooter is still as intense and scary today as it was then. In fact, it's shockingly good. You can get it right now on PC, Xbox One, and even Xbox Series X with Auto HDR, and it still controls exceedingly well, features some great shooting mechanics, and looks pretty great. But most importantly, Dead Space can still scare the hell out of you, with a combination of great sound design, excellent jump scares, ridiculously gross monsters, and awesome set-piece moments. Based on recent reports, Electronic Arts looked at the massive success of Capcom's Resident Evil 2 remake and thought that Dead Space was ripe for a similar treatment. But Resident Evil 2 on the original PlayStation is today, realistically, kind of ugly and clunky. It's a tough game to go back to in its original form despite being full of great ideas and frightening moments. It's the kind of game where visual and mechanical overhaul helps bring its best ideas forward into a modern setting. While Dead Space might be getting on in years, the technical leaps from the 7th generation of consoles to now aren't nearly as drastic as those from the PlayStation 1 era. Games play pretty much the same now as they did 12 years ago, and they still look pretty damn good. So perhaps a more apt comparison might be the Resident Evil 1 HD remake. In 1996, Resident Evil was released to the PlayStation 1. Later, the game received its own major upgrade with a full-on remaster for the GameCube in 2002. At this point, the game looked good enough to not necessarily need a major overhaul, but in 2015, the GameCube remaster received its own HD remaster, now for the PS3, PS4, Xbox 360, and Xbox One. It wasn't a necessary upgrade per se, it didn't include the major changes that Resident Evil 2 had, but it did do a couple of important things. For one, the game sold well. Incredibly well, in fact. At the time, Capcom announced the Resident Evil HD Remaster was the company's fastest-selling digital title ever. Not only that, but it also broke the record on PSN for opening day sales of a digital game. In other words, this was what truly set the ball in motion for more Resident Evil remakes. And while, unlike Dead Space, the franchise has continued to have successful titles, especially with the series reinvigorated from Resident Evil 7 and now Village, this was a pivotal cornerstone showing just how much audiences wanted Resident Evil games and how much they were willing to speak with their wallets. For two, and a point I think can be missed among those of us who grew up with Dead Space and are dying for a brand new one, that's not the case for many up-and-coming gamers today. This was a similar case for the original Resident Evil game. Resident Evil 1 is considered an absolute classic amongst survival horror fans, and absolutely still holds up today, especially the GameCube remake. But as the years pass, the likelihood of new gamers playing it drastically drops. So while these remasters might not be something fans of the original need to play, they can introduce an entirely new audience to an incredible series. That also means brand new fans along with the old who will be excitedly awaiting a sequel. The first two Dead Space games are absolutely wonderful, and in many ways the Alien and Aliens of the video game world, so they're games I would love to share with a brand new generation of gamers. A final point is that these games aren't typically too labor-intensive for the main creative staff of a company, but can be handed off to external studios who specialize in remakes and remasters, just like Bluepoint was able to do for Shadow of the Colossus and Demon's Souls. All in all, it's a relatively cheap way for a company to assess how popular a series is, and in my opinion, could even lead to a sequel if there's enough interest. But considering Dead Space is already such a good-looking game, what are some ways the game could be remade with more than just upped graphics? The more I think about it though, the more I think it's possible for a remake of Dead Space to do wonders for the phenomenal and distinct franchise. There are a ton of great ideas that don't need changing in Dead Space, and while a graphical overhaul would be nice, it's definitely not essential. But there's a whole lot of room for a remade Dead Space to expand itself and revive the whole franchise like yet another unkillable necromorph through story. When it was released, Dead Space came at a time when games were starting to really lean into doing some smart things with narrative, but didn't quite have the resources or graphical power to put that narrative on screen. The result was, and is, a heavy reliance on audio logs. Dead Space has characters who show up in certain places to talk with the player character, Isaac Clarke, and they'll call out on the radio to discuss objectives or pressing situations. But really, like BioShock and countless others from the era, Dead Space is a game where you arrive after the disaster, and the only way to learn about it is by finding tidbits left behind by the people who are already dead. That setup is kind of fundamental to Dead Space, and I'm not advocating for a change to it, although as Dead Space 2 showed, being caught in the middle of a disastrous outbreak of undead monsters is just as frightening as arriving in its aftermath. But there's a lot that could be done to tweak Dead Space's story and world building to make them more clear and immediate, to pull players in deeper and ultimately make future Dead Space titles more viable. The story of the USG Ishimura, where Dead Space takes place, is one tied to the planet Aegis 7. On this mining colony, the people on the planet discovered an alien artifact called a marker, which first started working on the colonists' minds to make them hallucinate and go mad, and eventually turn them into a bunch of mutated undead necromorph monsters. You learn tidbits of this story from audio logs all over the Ishimura, how it arrived at Aegis 7 just before the disaster, how it brought the marker on board, and how it ultimately succumbed to madness and monsters of its own. This isn't to say anything is wrong with this type of storytelling. In fact, I absolutely love how similar stories are told where you put together the puzzle of what happened, like Dark Souls. However, in that vein, I think more could be added to flesh out the environmental storytelling. Some of this is certainly present in Dead Space, but every room can tell a story of its own of what struggle took place there, and how that struggle took place. Part of the horror of Dead Space is the mystery, the unknown. Where's the crew? What are these creatures? How do I stop them? So by presenting even more mystery within the environment, it could only serve to boost this element. If EA chose another route, we could even see more of the story many fans don't even know. Dead Space has a bunch of additional materials that fill in the gaps of what happened during the first game and could absolutely expand on what's in the Dead Space remake. There's a motion comic that was released beside the game that tells the tale of the outbreak on Aegis 7, and an animated movie, Dead Space Downfall, that shows what happened aboard the Ishimura before your arrival. If you were a Dead Space player but not a die-hard fan, you've probably never seen all of this extra material, to say nothing of the other comics and novels that tie into the universe. So with advances in gaming tech over the last decade, plus a whole lot of ancillary story material that already exists, Dead Space could include additional elements beyond audio logs and text messages that showcase this. In fact, there's no reason Dead Space has to stick with only the story of what happens in the existing game at all. Dead Space is actually a huge, interesting world with a lot of moving political parts as relates to corporations, governments in deep space, and the state of religion in the far future. They're all essential to the story that developers at Visceral told in this first game and its sequels. Dead Space is already a rich world with a lot of extra story material, and this is a perfect opportunity to get that stuff shown on screen, and especially brought to life within the game itself beyond the comics and animated movie. We've seen video logs from Nicole sent to Isaac, so turning some of the crew's audio and text logs into video logs could be one way to show more of what we previously had to read. Another possibility could be in finding surveillance footage of certain events, or even arguments. This would be a good way to incorporate more of the game's rich lore, by showing squabbles over the game's politics, or even new ways to hint at unitology, the in-game religion that's spread throughout the Dead Space universe. Extra side missions could be added with characters who somehow managed to survive, with them relating their own experiences of what happened. There were a couple of survivors in the original game, and we could stumble upon a few more, perhaps one who is horrified by the events that have unfolded so far, and can obtusely relate the player to certain events revolving around what happened prior to the incident before meeting an untimely demise. I stand by Dead Space 1's decision not to relate too much of its story to the player and its slow drip approach, as this mystery is a part of the game's tension. Dead Space 2 does a great job expanding on that, but like Alien to Aliens, the horror of Dead Space 1 is in the unknown. But there are more ways that can be used within this approach to still maintain the game's mystery, but alternate how that story is approached. Ultimately, 2008's Dead Space 1 is already an excellent game as is, so I'll be happy to see even a bare-bones remake if that means introducing this series to a whole new audience. But if Electronic Arts wants a horror remake on par with Resident Evil 2, it has to take some serious notes from that game as well. RE2 isn't just a spiffed up version of an old game, it's a reimagined version with changes both subtle and expansive to make it a better game in many respects. It would be interesting to see what changes could be made to expand on the original game and make something well worth playing even for veterans of the original game.